So, Kathy, during this segment of Solutions for Mental Wellness, you have some other thoughts and ideas about what children are facing today and how we can help them. Can you continue with that?
Yes, it's important for us to know that exposure to stress and trauma can have negative consequences on up into the child's adult life. And many of the children that I work with are in foster care or have been adopted out of foster care or in kinship care. Kinship care is when they're in the care of someone in their family, such as a grandparent, an aunt or uncle. But many of these children have experienced extreme stress and trauma in their lives.
So, when you are talking about trauma, let's go ahead and define that, because there again, with social media, with the different things that are out there, I think it's hard for the general population to understand what we mean as therapists when we are talking about trauma, because there are different types of trauma. Can you speak to defining trauma a little bit?
Yes, trauma can come from many different ways. A child can be traumatized by a medical procedure. I had a little boy a number of years ago who the teachers were saying that he was disrupting the classroom because he was asking to go to the bathroom constantly. This child was in first grade. The parent brought him to me for a behavioral problem. And what I discovered was that this child did have extreme pain. He ended up going to the Medical University of South Carolina. They determined that he had Crohn's disease. He had to go through some very traumatic medical procedures, and that can be trauma. Trauma can be from things like right now we are thinking about children that are in Israel where there's war and they're hearing these sirens. I recently traveled to Turkey to work with the children that were affected by the earthquake.
Yes.
Most of the children, they were living in tents at this time, and they had lost their houses, and almost every one of these children had lost a family member. So things like that are natural disasters that can be traumatic for a child. But we also have abuse and neglect.
Yes.
And as you mentioned earlier, research shows that severe neglect can be even more harmful than physical abuse.
Yes. Yes, and I am seeing that in all of the populations of people I work with. And there is a phrase from when I was growing up called the latchkey kids. Mm-hmm. It's kids who had to come home from school by themselves, let themselves in the home, and eat a snack, and then their parents would return later. And so that was a part of our society in 40, 50 years ago. But today, it's not necessarily that a parent is out of the home. It's that the child is receiving no attention and their needs aren't getting met within the home. And so can you speak more about neglect and the impact that neglect has on child development?
The majority of the children that I see that are in foster care, they were removed from the home for neglect.
Yes.
We often think about children in foster care that it was physical abuse or sexual abuse. However, the majority was due to neglect. And sadly, it is often because of the parents' drug and alcohol issues. I've had cases where the children have been just sat in high chairs and left while the parents are abusing drugs. And in the play therapy room, the kids will act out what has happened to them. One little girl that was hoarding food in her mouth, because she was not fed at home. And thankfully, she was adopted by a caring person, so she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. But just those basic needs are not being met. And we have to remember that one of the basic needs that children have is nurturance.
Yes.
And if they are not nurtured, then they're at risk for an attachment disorder.
Yes. So when I think about that, I think about the study that was done several years ago with the Reese monkeys, and where there was a bottle with milk put out, and then there was a bottle with wire mesh wrapped in a terry cloth robe. And the monkey would not go to the nourishment of the food, it would go to the warmth of the terry cloth robe. And then there's an idea of failure to thrive in infancy when children do not receive enough physical touch or stimuli, that they can fail to thrive and grow and reach certain developmental milestones that are necessary for healthy development. And so we've seen and we've known that for years, but we've not made the jump to understand that that just doesn't stop in infancy and toddlerhood, that children need healthy physical touch. They need healthy social between their parents and themselves. They need healthy boundaries to know that they are safe, and they need to believe that they belong and that they have a purpose. And so let's talk a little bit now about some other abuses that children, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but let's talk about some other abuses children experience and what can be done to alleviate their suffering.
Even infants and very young children can be affected adversely
Yes.
by these traumatic events in their life. And we've talked about neglect and the dangers of that and the issues it can cause with attachment. But we also need to remember that there are other types of abuse. There's physical abuse. Physical abuse would include hitting, kicking, burning. I've seen many, many examples, sadly, of physical abuse. Emotional abuse is the most difficult to prove.
Yes.
This is when the child is told, you'll never amount to anything. I wish you'd never been born, that they're called ugly names. And so the reason it's so hard to prove is it's because it's the child's word against the parents. I actually had a situation where a little boy told me in session, my mom tells me all the time that she hates me. Mom was sitting in the room and she didn't deny it. And my thinking was, I am not surprised that this child is having issues at school and with behavior. The last is sexual abuse. And sexual abuse really can cause some severe trauma in children. That is lifelong. And sexual abuse would include many things. It would include improper touching. It would include pornography, taking pictures or making the child watch pornography. It can include rape.
Yes.
And sexual abuse is one of those things that can lead to later post-traumatic stress disorder because it's typically ongoing. Most of the time, it's not a one-time occurrence.
Yes.
And sadly, it is usually a family member who is sexually abusing the child.
Yes. Let's talk more about childhood sexual abuse and the long-term effects with that. So when a child is sexually abused, trust is broken. And so we've spoken about broken trust before, but for a child who's been sexually abused, you mentioned that to rebuild that trust is really hard. So speak more about what the child needs to be able to feel safe once they've been sexually abused.
First of all, the child needs to feel that they are believed.
Yes.
I have so many children that tell me that they told someone and that person did not believe them. And sadly, sometimes it's the mother
Yeah.
that they told and the parent did not believe them. There are oftentimes it's a stepfather or a mom's boyfriend who is the abuser. And the children then wonder, why is mom choosing that person over me? So it's important for us as therapists to let the child know, if you tell me something, I will believe you.
Yes.
And I'm going to do something to make this stop. When this is a family member, I had a child who was once told by someone else in the family, we can never have Thanksgiving again because you told on Grandpa.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's very common.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the child feels that sense of guilt of, okay, I've destroyed the family. They say we can't ever have Thanksgiving again because of this. And so it is just really difficult for the child to begin trusting again. Often they develop a fear. If it was a male abuser to a female, the females develop a fear of men.
Yes.
And they think that all men are going to be abusive, and we know that that's not true.
That's absolutely not true. Yes. Yes. So it sounds like children, again, receive the message they don't matter, they have the responsibility, and that they're not safe. How important is a child's voice? When we're working with children in the therapy room, the very first thing that we are trained to do is to affirm that we believe them. And then what is the next thing that they need to know about how they've used their voice, what they have shared with us?
I think that it's important for us to tell children that they can tell us anything.
Yes.
And that the play therapy room or the therapy room is a safe place. And that regardless of, I tell them sometimes when I'm doing a genogram, the family tree,
Yes.
that they can tell me that that person is nice, sweet, and kind, or mean, rotten, and ugly. And that kind of clears the way for them to tell me whatever they need to. I have a story about a child that I was working with. This was a 7-year-old girl, and she went behind the puppet stage, and she got one of the puppets, and she moved the puppet's mouth. And I said, it looks like he's trying to tell me something, but I don't hear anything. And she went and shook the puppet's head. And then she did it again. And I said, wow, I wonder if the cat's got his tongue. He's trying to tell me something, but I don't hear anything. And she shook again. And then I repeated like that. And finally, she stepped out from behind the puppet stage and said, my daddy said I can't tell you anything. And this is why play therapy can be so helpful.
Yes.
Because the father had told her, you can't tell the therapist what's happening. You can't tell anyone. This is a secret. And in play therapy, she was able to show that to me through using the puppets.
Yes.
And that's why play therapy can be so powerful. It allows the kids to express what they need to.
So they get to develop a voice.
Yes.
And they get to develop a language. And they get to label things. And then teach us. So it sounds like it's very empowering for children to go through a therapeutic process. So let's say a child has been abused. What are some other things that they need from teachers, because much like children who are misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed with ADHD, children who experience sexual abuse are going to have odd or different behaviors in the classroom.
Yes. So children need to, or the teachers need to be aware
Yes.
of some of the signs. April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, and that is a time that schools can do activities to let the teachers know what are some of the signs, but also to let the children know that they can tell someone.
Yes.
Teachers are mandated reporters just like we are. And so they have a responsibility if a child comes to them or if they're noticing some of these signs and symptoms. For example, and this is from my own caseload, a first grader should not know about the sex act.
Yes.
And if you overhear that child talking about those things, then you know that there is something happening that should not be happening to that child. And as mandated reporters, we only have to have suspicion of abuse. We do not have to have proof. That goes to either Department of Social Services or the police.
Yes.
To find the proof of that. But we need to make the reports, and teachers need to not be afraid to make a report.
Yes. So to speak to that a little bit, my husband and I, years ago, before we had our children, and actually when I was pregnant with our oldest, we had a church van ministry because we live in a very rural area. And so we picked a lot of different children up, and we would both ride the van together. My husband would drive, and there was a second grader, and this second grader told me about oral sex. He said, "Do you know about oral sex?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" Because I'm, kids can hear words and then try the words out. And so I wanted to make sure I was understanding what this child said. And he proceeded to tell me. And so even though in that capacity I was functioning as within my local church,
Right.
church workers, whether it's paid staff or volunteers, are mandated reporters.
Exactly.
And if at the very least the report needs to be made to the Department of Social Services here in South Carolina, or to Child and Family Services, sometimes it's called in other states, and then to law enforcement. Those reports have to be made. It is not a therapist or a church worker's responsibility to investigate. But it is our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable and to be a voice if the child doesn't have a voice. Those reports are anonymous as well.
And I have actually done workshops for churches for their workers and volunteers who worked with the children and teens to let them know what their responsibilities are, because often that's not talked about.
Yes.
The Sunday school teachers don't necessarily know that they're a mandated reporter. My husband's a pastor. Because he lives with a therapist, he knows that he's a mandated reporter. But sometimes the church workers don't know. And so that's why it's important for us to let the people in our churches know those things, or to call someone in to do a workshop, as I've done for some other churches before.
Yes. So, Kathy, as we are closing today's session, there's a few things I think we need to just state. A lot of our attention has been towards parents and towards educators, but children are raised in community. And there are a lot of other people like coaches and mentors. Your son is a mentor. I'm sure he knows about what children need for healthy development. And if a child isn't in a healthy environment, what he can do to help that child, and he is a mandated reporter as well. So what are some things that some other people can do? And then as we close today, I do want to end on a hopeful note. And so let's start there with what other people who are in the community and are other supports to children can do to help children who have been neglected, physically abused, or sexually abused.
We've all heard the saying, it takes a village
Yes.
to raise a child. And so I think one of the biggest things is to not be afraid to get involved. If you notice those children in your church, in your neighborhood, that seem to have some issues, it's important to reach out and to see if we can be a help in some kind of way. I remember when my children were young, some boys up the street that were not attending church, and they were good friends of my kids. And so we invited them to go with us. We took them to church, and then eventually the parents started coming too. So we can make a difference in something as small as that.
Yes.
Just being there and being willing to step forward. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that our communities can do, as well as other people. I am a grandparent of 14.
Wow.
And
That's
so there's a lot of research about the importance of grandparents and how children are more successful if the grandparents are very active in their lives.
Yes.
That's going to their ball games, going to their concerts, different things like that that can just make such a difference.
Yes. All of this is communicating to the children that they matter.
Yes.
And we do know from Scripture that they matter.
Yes.
Absolutely, they matter. And that they were created on purpose with a purpose. And one of the passages, too, as I was a teenager reading Scripture, when I came across the passage, it just seemed so odd and out of place about how the Lord knows the number of hairs on our head. And I've always had thick hair. And that just really said, God cares so much about me. He is so intimate in his knowledge of me, and he wants good for me. And so God, in my relationship with my Heavenly Father, he has brought me much healing because I've experienced some of what we've talked about today. And so he has brought me hope and healing. And if he can do that with me, he's willing to do that with anyone. When I went to therapy as a client, I told my therapist, I said, I have spent hours every day for over a year praying and just saying, Lord, heal me of the thoughts and the feelings and the fears that I have. Lord, heal me of just going to the grocery store was hard. Lord, heal me of all these things. I would study his word and try to find, Lord, what is going to make this better? And I would read scriptures like be anxious for nothing. And then that created a shame cycle for me because I'm like, I'm riddled with anxiety, or I was riddled with fears. But I was given a language through therapy to understand I was having an anxious response. And so the Lord, because of the therapist that was worked with me and still works with me 20 years into it, he works with me to help me see the Lord. And so it's not, prayer and Bible was huge in healing, but the Lord also uses people to heal. And as marriage and family therapists, one of our basic tenets is we heal in relationship with one another. And so everyone who has a relationship with a child can choose to be a healing instrument for that child. And I want to say this, that when we choose to ignore a child's abuse and their pain, we're choosing to join with their perpetrator.
That's powerful. Often, if that child says to the parent, I just want to kill myself, the parents don't believe it. They think that they just want attention.
One of the things that parents are doing when they come in and they meet with that, they're just attention seeking, then they are communicating to their child that their child's needs do not matter.